Hi there everyone, how is it going? In this video we're going to be creating a web API project with the CRUD operations. We're going to be performing these main operations in order to learn how to work with web APIs. We're going to be using a service to interact with a database instead of doing this inside the controller, and we are also going to see many other concepts such as data transfer objects, among other things. So just keep on watching. So firstly, we're going to need to create a new project. We're going to need to select an API template, an ASP.NET Core Web API with a C# as the language. Click on Next. I'm going to need to give the project a name. Okay, click on Next. We'll leave this by default as they are. And we're just gonna need to wait until the project loads. So this is our project. So what we can do first, we can add a folder to add the models. We're just gonna create one model. And so I'm adding a class in the models folder, and I'm just creating, a users model. I mean, APIs can be about anything, about a bunch of different things. So I'm just gonna create a simple model here. So it will take an int ID property. A string name, or I'm just gonna write it as a first name, and then I can create a last name property. And the public int personal number. I mean, just some data for a user. We can make here the first name and the last name as nullable, just to remove those errors there. We would have just left them as they were. But what we're gonna need to add now here is I'm gonna add the data folder so that we create the context. So I'm gonna add the class inside of it. And I'm gonna put a name for the context, so like CRUD, the API context. Normally it should be something, I'll make it a bit shorter. Okay, so this is our context class. This needs to inherit DB context, which I don't think is known because we should have installed something before, the entity framework core. So find and install the latest version. But we can also go to dependencies, manage NuGet packages, and we can install a few other packages that we need. So these were the packages already installed by default by the project template. And what I'm gonna need is just a couple more packages that will enable us to make interaction with the database. So the first one is going to be entity framework core .tools, which allows us to add migrations and this bunch of operations here relating the database. So accept. Okay, this was installed. The next one is going to be the SQL Server extension, so that we can connect the project to the SQL Server database. And I'm gonna click on install here, accept. Okay, so this was also installed, I guess now. So we can go back to our context. Okay, so we need a constructor inside the context, which is going to be API context. So it takes a bunch of parameters inside of it. You can see this in the documentation, or just copy this as it is. So I don't learn this by heart. I just open the documentation to see these arguments that the context constructor takes. And here down below, for each model that we create, we also need to create a dbset instance of that model. So for the user, and we'll name it users. And I think I need to import the models here. Okay, everything is fine. So the context basically connects our models to the database. And as we've already explained, and I'm gonna need to create a database. And just go to View, Server Explorer, and click on top here, create new SQL Server database. I'm gonna need to open the SQL Server Studio to get the server name that I have. So this was loaded. I'm just gonna copy here the server name, and I'm gonna paste it here. Just put here a name for the database, just like whatever. Okay, so the database was created, and here in the property window, we can copy the connection string, which is the physical location of the database, and we need to write it here in the app settings.json file. So connection strings, inside of it, I'm putting a name to the connection string, like a default connection string, but the name doesn't matter. You can put whatever you want there. I'm pasting down here the connection string, and here I'm going to write encrypt. I'm going to set encrypt to false, because when we connect to the database, we don't have any password or so. And what's left to do is go to program.cs. Here in program.cs, we're going to need to add it as a service, the context. And so builder.services .add db context. Okay, so inside of it is going to be the name of our context. So options that use SQL Server, and inside the parentheses here, we're gonna actually specify also the connection string name. So builder.configuration get connection string, and we'll put here the name of our connection string. So this is just some routine stuff, the way that we set up the database. You don't really need to learn many things by heart, but okay, so I forgot here to, I think I've forgotten something here. It gives me an error. Okay, so the name of the context was API context, not CRUD API context. And things look okay. Okay, now we just need to add the migrations for the model that we created, for the connection string, for the context instance. So just add migration, a name there to the migration. Okay, build succeeded. Here we just need to update the database now. Okay, so now things look good to go. We're gonna delete this default controller that there was there and this default weather forecast class. Okay, so we need to add a controller, and we'll click on API and create an API controller empty. So this is the template. I'm gonna name it users controller since it's the name of the model. And here's our API controller. So here we're gonna create a service in a bit, and here we're gonna add a variable to access that service. And we will create here the constructor for this class. And we'll give here, so we'll give this service variable the value of the service. So in just a bit, we're gonna create this service that I'm talking about. But here I'm just gonna start writing the name of the first method, which is gonna be an public async task. It will return an iAction result. And it's gonna be an enumerable of users. The name of the method is going to be GetUsers, and I'm not writing here again the value that the enumerable takes because we're not going to be using users actually. So in Web APIs, a concept that we'll usually use are DTOs, which are data transfer objects that basically are just a subset of a model that we have. So we can go to the root project directory and add a folder. I'm naming it DTOs, which were data transfer objects. And inside of it, I'm adding a class. I'm naming it user DTO. And what DTOs allow us to do is they're basically just a subset of a model. So when we don't want to show specific information about our model or just want to separate it into different parts, so we only want to show one part or something like that, we use DTOs. We will be using them a lot in Web APIs. And in our case, for example, I'm just copying everything from the user model except of the ID, because so I'm just gonna make it so we don't show the ID because the ID is actually something sensitive. So the user won't show the ID when they create a user, when they access the API, or when we take the information from the API, we won't see the ID of the user. So the return type here is going to be user DTO. Okay, I just imported there the DTO directory. And in the data folder, we will create, firstly, to create the service, we need an interface. And I'm going to name it iUsers service. So this interface will just pretty much select the signature of the methods that we're gonna write in our service. So the first method is gonna be a task. It will return an I enumerable of user DTOs. And the name, I'm gonna put it getAll. So the reason why we do the services basically is just, okay, so I'm importing here DTOs directories. So I'm gonna add the folder of services, and I'm gonna input here the interface and the service inside this folder. The reason that we write services, as I was saying, is just that it's not a good practice to access the context or the database from the controller. So we do this inside the services. So accessing, getting data and putting data in the database is better to be done inside the service. So that's the whole reason we're doing it this way, as we have talked about it before also in MVC. So here I'm gonna create the user service .cs, and this service is going to implement the iUser service. If we click on the show errors and implement methods, we're going to see this method implemented that we had in our interface. So I just wrote async in front of it, and okay, we're gonna need a variable to access the context. So private read-only API context, I'll name it underline context as a practice. And of course here we're creating the constructor. And as I've said, we will use user DTOs. So to return data in that format, so I'm gonna need a method here, which is gonna take user, which is gonna return user DTOs. I'll name it user2DTO. And what this basically will do is just take a user object and return a user DTO object. So, okay, this is going to be the form of the method, of the function that I'm creating here. So, this function will create a new user DTO, and what it will have, the first name of it will be the user's first name, the last name of the user DTO will be the last name of the user, and so on. Because we're gonna be using this thing in all of our methods below, so that's why we are using a function on top of it, so we will have it easier to use. To turn users into user DTOs in all of our methods. And we can just now start working with our first method. So we'll return await context.users .select. So in the users context, we'll select from all of the users. So we'll take each user and we'll perform this user2DTO function to them, or method to them. So then to list async. So the reason for the mistake is that in the function created above, it should take a user as a parameter, not a user DTO. So I'm gonna import here the modals, and it should just work fine now. Okay, so I was missing an importing entity framework core on top. There are no errors now. And we can go to the users controller, and here the service, okay, we'll import these services, data.services directory, and the service should work now. We can just go and handle our first method. So we'll write a variable of users, and this will take all of the users in form of a DTO. So we will await service underline service dot get all, and this method will return us all of our users in a DTO form. And in web APIs, we will return an OK response, and which will take users as well. The return OK users basically just means that everything is okay, so it returns a 200 code response in the HTTP response, and it returns the users as well. This is just some basic return type in web APIs. We will see also the other ones, how they what we return in the other cases. Okay, so when we run the project, if we try to get all of the users, we'll probably see an error because we haven't added the services in our program.cs, which we will do now. So here we will add builder.services we will add our services as scoped, so add scoped, and we'll write here the name of the interface and the service, and this will basically be it. If we run the application one more time, we should be able to get all of our users, but of course, since we haven't created any users yet, we'll basically just see an empty array, I suppose. So we can click on try it out, execute, and as a response body, we have an empty array, but the code is 200 because the HTTP response were a success. So yes, we can just go ahead and create the rest of our methods in our controller. So the next method is going to be an HTTP get to get the items, to get just one specific item or one specific user, and this HTTP get tags will have an ID here, which basically what this ID here means is just that when this method is invoked, whatever the ID is in the URL of the API address, the ID will be passed into the method. So basically in the parameter of the method. Okay, so we can go and write our signature method here, which is going to be task. It will return a user DTO. I'll name it get by ID. And it will take an int ID as a parameter. Okay, we'll implement here the interface or that specific method. We're gonna make it asynchronous. So what we're gonna write here, we need a variable for the users to store the users, and we'll take from the context the users that find async, which takes the ID as a parameter. This has to be an await process, and we will return the user variable as a DTO, so we'll use this user to DTO function, and we'll go back to the controller, and here we're also gonna need to store to create a user variable, and here we will store what we will get, the user DTOs that we will get from the service that getById method that we just created in the service. And we just need to make a short if clause here. So if the user is null, we will return like no contact. We will return no content or not found, actually, which will be a 404 code. And if everything is okay, we'll return an OK response code with the users as a parameter. So we'll get the user returned as well. The next method we're going to be handling is going to be the HTTP put method. It will take also an ID in order to take the ID for the specific user. So public async task. No object will be returned, and the name of the method will be PutUser, and it will take an int ID and the user DTO as a parameter. Okay, so we need to go back to the iUser service interface, and here at task user DTO will be the return type, and update, I'll name the method. It will take an ID and a user DTO as a parameter. If we go to the user service here, we can implement the method or the method signature. Okay, so in this user variable, we will store the specific user that we are talking about, so that we need here. So users that find async ID, and we'll make an if clause here. So if the user is not null, so what we're gonna do here is we're gonna assign to the user. So to the user, we're gonna assign the values of the user DTOs that we take from the parameters. So when a user inputs some data, it will input the data as a user DTO, and we will take this and convert it to the user, and then we will basically save this user to the database. So we need an await context that save changes async to store the changes to the database, and we will return the user DTO again. So this was it. If we go to the controller now, we will take in a user variable, we will await underline service that update, which will take the ID and the user DTO. So the user will be updated, and a user DTO will be returned. And if this user variable is null, we will return a 404 code or not found code. Else we will return an OK. Else we will return no content at all, which is some other code. Actually in APIs, but so we don't need to return anything. Okay, so we have our last two methods to create. The first one is going to be an HTTP post, and it will be a public async task to return action result and a user DTO, it's going to be a user DTO, and the name of the method is going to be PostUser, and it will take as an argument a user DTO, which will be inputted by the user by us. So the next step is again to create the method signature in the interface. So it will be a task, an asynchronous method. It will return a user, and I'm going to name it add here. It takes a user DTO as a parameter, and it returns the user. So I need to import the models directory in this interface, and here we can implement what we just created. So in this, we write as usual user variable, and here inside of it we'll create a new user. So we'll take a user DTO as an input from the person who uses the API, and we'll create from it a user. The first name of the user will be the user DTO's first name, and so on. So basically, when the user creates a user, it creates actually a user DTO because he doesn't specify the ID, and we will take that and turn it into a user and create a user. So in the context, we'll add this user that we just created, and we'll just then save the changes and also return the user. That was it. Just go to the controller. So inside this user variable, we will store the result of the method in our service. So we'll add the user DTO to our database, and the return type in this case, so when we create a resource, so when we create a user or something else, we usually write this created at action. And what it does is that it returns an HTTP 201 status code if what we wanted to create was created successfully. And what it also does is that it adds a location header to the response. In the location header, I specified some data about what we created, so like the method where you can access it, its ID, and what it is that we created. Okay, so our last method is going to be an HTTP delete method, which also takes an ID here. So public async task, it returns an iAction result. It basically just doesn't return like an object, and the name is going to be a DeleteUser, and it will of course have an int ID as a parameter. We'll just need to go to the iUser service, and the signature of this method is going to be, of the method that we're going to create, is going to be task, delete, and as a parameter an int ID. So basically it just doesn't return anything. Okay, let me just find it. Okay, I'll make it an asynchronous method. Here, I'm going to just create a user variable. Here, I'm going to, in the context, .users. So here, I'm just going to find the specific user. And if the user is not null, we're going to be deleting that user. So underline context .users .remove user, and then we're just going to need to await to save the changes in the database. And that is basically it. We're just going to need to write a few lines here. So to implement that method from the service. So just await underline service .delete, and it takes the ID. And we'll just return no content at all, because we don't need to. So in the HTTP response, there will be nothing returned. So no content. And if we run the application to test all of our methods, you will probably just understand them a bit better. So before we try to send a request to the get API users endpoint, now we're going to try and create a user. Here we will create a user DTO actually, because we won't be inputting the ID. So just like James, Gordon, some value for the age and for the personal number. And if you click execute, the user will be created in the database. And this is the content, what the HTTP request contains that we created, and the response will be this 201 code, which basically means that the resource was created as we were doing before. The response body tells us the information of the object that we created. And if we see in the response headers, we see this location property here, which tells us the location of the user that was created. And we talked about it here when we created the PostUser method in the return created at action, and this was what this method did. So it just also returned the location header to the response with the data of the user that we created. Okay, so we created the user. We tested this API endpoint. We can go ahead and test the get ID endpoint. So we'll put one there, execute. And in the response, we take a 200 code, a success code, and this is the object that was in that address. So if we go back and see here what we did in the GetUser method, we searched for that user and we returned OK, the 200 code, and the user in the response. So yeah, I mean, if you check this and check what these methods do, you will probably just understand them a bit better. So if we try and update something in the put API endpoint, I don't know, I don't remember what I wrote before, so I'm just gonna be replacing all of this, but yeah, we inputted there the ID of the user, and here we will update it. If you click on execute, so the new user was created, or it was updated. If we go to the PutUser method, so here we take the ID and the user DTO, we update it, and we actually return no content, which is this 204 code that we saw here, if everything was successful. The last one, what we could actually try, I think, okay, if we try the getAll method here, or the get API endpoint, it worked again, and what is left for us to do is to try and delete something. So in the delete endpoint, we click the ID of one, and we take a response of 204, which is a response of no content. So we deleted the user and we return nothing. If we go to this get API users endpoint and check, we have an empty array again, so we have no users stored in the database. So yeah, that was all. I hope you learned something from the video. Make sure to subscribe if you want more content, and just keep watching the upcoming videos to get a clearer view at web APIs in .NET. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.